A very warm welcome to our club. Thanks for such a good turnout tonight on what is one of the most extraordinary stories most of us have covered, the protests in Hong Kong, which show no signs at all of ending. Bear with us while I think our staff get you whatever you're ordering. And any of you, by the way, who aren't members of the club, do think about joining. We're one of the cheapest clubs in Asia, and it's a great community, and you do get significant discounts if you're a member. So if you come to even 2 or 3 of these events, it'll pay for itself. So think about that. Membership is easy. You certainly don't have to be a journalist. In fact, most of our members now are not journalists. If you look by the door where our staff are, you'll find there are forms you can fill in there. It's very quick. We've got a couple of events coming up that you ought to know about. Next Monday, we're going to be showing for the first time here in Thailand a documentary produced by actually a former board member, freelance documentary maker Pailin Waddell, whose father, in fact, is a former president in many years gone by. Pailin has worked for years on a documentary on about a family who have lost their daughter for a very serious illness at a very young age and have decided to have cells frozen in a facility in Arizona, in the hope that at some point in the future she might somehow be able to be reconstituted. There are all sorts of moral issues, of course, there, but it is actually a very poignant personal story. The documentary is called Hope Frozen. There are copyright limitations. We're only allowed to show it to members who are each allowed to bring one guest, so there's a bit of a limitation. But it's an extremely moving and powerful documentary, and it'll be your first chance to see it in this region. That's on Monday, the 16th of September. On Wednesday, we're running a panel looking at Cambodia, whether it's a victim or beneficiary of the huge changes that have taken place in that country over the last few years, when there's been massive Chinese investment, a crackdown on free expression. The place is really being transformed, and it's an open-ended discussion about just who's benefiting and whether in fact there are good things or just bad things for the country in that. And don't forget, any of you who've joined the club in the last several months, that we have new members' nights. We're having one on the 20th of September. These are always really great social occasions. It's on Friday the 20th. You do actually get, the tradition is to have a guided tour of the bureaus associated with the Foreign Correspondents Club, but sadly in recent years we've dwindled. There aren't many of us left. I actually head one of the very few bureaus left, which is next door, behind that wall, the BBC bureau. And there isn't, these days, there's not a whole lot to see, but we do give you a kind of tour of a news bureau here and give you an idea about how they work and what they try to do. But the event's much better just because it's a fantastic mix of people. We keep it very informal, and it's a very good chance to meet other people who joined more recently. So let's get on to tonight's event. And we were very keen to hold this because so many journalists based here have been pulled into Hong Kong over the last 3 months to cover this extraordinary protest movement that has been amazingly tenacious and persistent. Young, idealistic Hong Kongers who have maintained a movement that started with a very angry public response to an attempt to introduce an extradition bill whereby people could be extradited under some circumstances to China, which seemed to many Hong Kongers to trample on the one country, two systems guarantees they thought they had under the deal from the British withdrawal. But that's expanded now. There are, of course, what they call the 5 demands of the protesters, which include the resignation of Chief Executive Carrie Lam and a full independent investigation of the police. But you sense there's more to it than that. Some of the protests have dragged in extraordinary numbers of the Hong Kong population, and we're talking, 10, 15% of the entire population joining mass rallies to show their objections to what the government's been doing. And you sense that there is in this something much bigger, a kind of cry of rage at the way in which Hong Kong's freedoms are gradually being eroded. And we've seen that over the years with, for example, the abduction of activists who thought they were safe and then turning up in China. And of course, the frustration that the government in Hong Kong is still not elected by a universal franchise. It's still effectively under the thumb of China. But perhaps the biggest thing that hangs over Hong Kong, of course, is we're now only 28 years away from the point at which Hong Kong reverts to full Chinese rule. And there's no doubt that is on the minds, in particular, of younger Hong Kongers who feel that they will not get to enjoy the freedoms that their parents have enjoyed. They are up against a government that is, in effect, backed by China, which means most people think, what could they possibly achieve? And yet, amazingly, they've kept going. I mean, I've covered protest movements right across this region going back 25 years, and I can't think of one that has been as inventive, as idealistic, and as determined as this one. It's quite remarkable to watch it when you think, we say to them, you're not going to win, you're up against China, and it doesn't deter them. Huge numbers of young people who've given up everything to go and join this movement. It is, of course, because of Hong Kong's freedoms that we're also able to see a great deal more of what's going on. As journalists, we have far more freedom to get up close and film what's going on than we would in any of the protests we've covered in the rest of Asia. And one of the big factors so far is that they're not using live rounds. It makes it much easier for journalists to operate when they're not going to get actually shot and killed. So it is a very different kind of a protest from one we've covered before. But we're very pleased tonight to be able to welcome Bonnie Leung is joining us from Hong Kong. You'll see her up on the screen there via Skype. We would have loved to have had people from... They're all waving at you, Bonnie. Anyway, it's a good crowd here. We would love to have had more people from Hong Kong, but it's a limit to how many people we can bring on Skype. There's nobody better. She's a leader of the Civil Rights Front, which was formed in 2002 to give ordinary Hong Kongers a voice, and has been a leading... I won't say she's a leader of the protest movement, a thinker and an inspiration behind the protest movement, and a spokesperson for it. We've also got Michael Caster, who is a human rights activist who's been involved particularly in helping human rights defenders in China, and has looked particularly closely at the tactics of the Hong Kong police against the protest movement and how they've evolved, and has a good context also on China's thinking and involvement in Hong Kong. And last and definitely not least is Wayne Hay. I'm delighted to welcome him to a panel of the Foreign Correspondents Club. He's been reporting in this region for many, many years, right across Southeast Asia. He's one of the most experienced correspondents, and I would also say one of the soberest and most reliable voices you will hear working for the Al Jazeera network, and he's spent a great deal of the last 3 months in Hong Kong reporting the protests. Bonnie, I'm going to start with you if I can. Warm welcome to our club, and perhaps you could outline for us how the protest movement has evolved and what its objectives are now, given that everyone knows you're ultimately up against what we might call the Great Wall called China.
Thank you, Jonathan. You hear me clearly, right?
You're great.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to represent not only my group, Civil Human Rights Front, and also, of course, Hong Kong people to say thank you to all the journalists. Because in this movement, we know that Hong Kong people cannot do it alone. We need international support. So we are so very grateful that a lot of journalists come to Hong Kong from all over the world to help us to bring the truth to the world. And we hope that by telling the truth, by the world knowing the truth, that we'll get support. So thank you, Jonathan. And I would like to start by talk a little bit about the background of this movement. Actually, the whole anti-extradition bill movement starts not only from June. June was our first massive march that 1 million people took to the streets. But actually, the whole thing started from about March and April of this year. The whole thing started with a very sad case, a murder case, which happened in Taiwan. And a victim was killed. And the accused went back to Hong Kong because there was no extradition arrangement between Hong Kong and Taiwan where the murder took place. So, of course, the parents of the victims would like to find a way to send the accused back to Taiwan to let him to face fair trial. And of course, Hong Kong people would support such arrangement if it's one-time matter, and also the human rights, freedom of speech, everything in Hong Kong, the whole system, would not be harmed. But amazingly, the government found a way that not only could not serve this purpose, but also it was harm the Hong Kong system totally. So a lot of lawyers, a lot of scholars, a lot of pan-democratic legislators warned Hong Kong people about it, explained to Hong Kong people what is wrong with this extradition bill, which will effectively make not only Hong Kong people, but also anyone who travel to Hong Kong would have a chance to be extradited to China or other countries or places where human rights are not protected. That is why Hong Kong people started to take to the streets. As I said, it's all started from March and April. And as a start, actually everything was not many people participated in this campaign at first. For example, at the end of March, we had about 12,000 people took to the streets against this extradition bill. And then 1 month later, because more lawyers, scholars, and people started to talk about it, more people, 130,000 people took to the streets at the end of April. So you see things actually escalated gradually. More and more people participated in this campaign. But unfortunately, the government did not listen. Even with 130,000 people took to the streets, the government still was arrogant enough not to discuss this bill with the elected pan-democratic legislators. So Hong Kong people see how arrogant the government is, how they do not care about the voices of people. But this extradition bill, we also know that would harm Hong Kong totally, would destroy the cornerstone of what makes Hong Kong, would destroy the safety that is promised in our basic law. That is why when it's come closer and closer to the legislation process, Hong Kong people on the middle of June took to the streets, and 1 million people showed up to stop this bill from passing. And after 1 million people took to the streets, again, the government decided to ignore people's voice. And on the very same day, after, I believe, 2 hours after we announced that there were 1 million people took to the streets, the government immediately announced through a statement that the legislation process will still carry on. And then, of course, on the 12th of June, which was supposed to be the beginning of the second reading of this extradition bill, people encircled. We encouraged people to encircle the Legislative Council to give the last pressure to the government to want them to withdraw the bill. At that day, we all know that if the second reading started, there is no way by the people of Hong Kong or by pan-democratic legislators that we can stop the bill, because in the past few years, the pro-Beijing legislators already changed the rule in the Legislative Council, and we cannot even do filibustering to stop the bill. So if it had started, the bill would have been passed. What made it stop was that some protesters, now we call them braves, some people call them radical protesters, but these protesters took to the streets and circled the Legislative Council and risked their life, risked their safety, risked facing 10 years of imprisonment, physically stopping the pro-Beijing legislators going back inside to the Legislative Council to start the second reading. That is why, after that day, Hong Kong people who all support the campaign understand that without the braves, without the people risking their lives and their future, without them, the bill would have been passed. If we were all peaceful, we were just waiting to be dispersed and arrested, and the bill would have been passed. That is why on the 12th of June, which is a very important date, that all Hong Kong people who support this campaign would understand that sometimes in our undemocratic system in Hong Kong, sometimes force is necessary. Otherwise, the bill would have been passed. That is why, no matter now you're categorized as peaceful protesters, like my group does, or you are the braves, we understand each other's strategy, and we understand the necessity of each other. As I said, the braves, sometimes their strategy is necessary. And also because the Civil Human Rights Front, my group, is considered to be totally peaceful. We organize marches that we would totally cooperate with the police. We tell them everything. We communicate with them so as to create a safe zone that people would know that when they come out to the streets, we would do our best to make sure that everyone will be physically and legally safe. You will not be dispersed, you will not be arrested. That is why 1 million people, then 2 million people, then 1.7 million people took to the streets knowing that they would be safe. That is why the Braves also consider us to be necessary, the peaceful protesters, because they know that without such safe zone, without this big number of participants as the spine of this campaign, the campaign will die down soon. So we understand each other's necessity. We appreciate each other, but we have the same goal, which is our 5 demands. Our 5 demands, of course, is the withdrawal of the bill, and then universal suffrage. And also 3 other demands, which is about started from the 12th of June, which is about hoping the government to withdraw the characterization of riot, and also amnesty for all the people who had been arrested, which I believe is already more than 1,000 people arrested. And also we request an independent inquiry to investigate at least all the police brutality who made the decision why the police would break the law, and hoping them all the police who broke the law will face fair trials, etc., etc. So to sum up these 5 demands, I can say that even after Carrie Lam announced the withdrawal of the bill, the campaign still would not die down, because the movement now is already much more than the request of withdrawal of the bill. We see police brutality every single day. We have new victims every single day. Much blood had been shed in the streets of Hong Kong. So now the campaign is as important of the extradition bill, and is also equally important to end the police brutality. So to sum up the 5 demands, Hong Kong people need a systematic protection to protect us, because, as I said, police use brutality. They break the law every single day, and in their practice every day, they lie to Hong Kong people every single day. So Hong Kong people now see that if we end the movement now somehow, if we just ditch the whole movement and go home, the police will think that, well, we can get away with all the police brutality. The government would think, well, we can get away even after 3 months of being totally inelastic to people's voices. So we cannot just leave it there. We have to sort a systematic protection under our system, a systematic change of the system. So Hong Kong people will see protection. We want to guarantee that in the future, when the government, and no matter it's Hong Kong government or Beijing government, if they want to dream up another evil bill that will again harm Hong Kong, destroy our freedom, destroy our human rights, we don't have to do this all again. We don't have to risk our lives. We don't have to face imprisonment. We don't have to face police brutality. We want to do it within our system. We want to oppose through the ballot box. This is what Hong Kong people are now fighting for. That is why, after Carrie Lam have announced withdrawing of the bill, Hong Kong people are still at the street. The momentum is still there, and we'll keep fighting on until we see our 5 demands be heard.
Bonnie,
that's about it.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Stay with
Thank
us. Very good to hear that perspective.
Thank you.
Wayne, you've covered this since June. Your view is that of a reporter on the street, but it is an extraordinary protest to witness as a journalist. Give us a sense of what you've seen and what your views of it are.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for inviting me too, and to the rest of the board of the FCC. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to see Michael and Bonnie as well. I interviewed Bonnie just last week, actually, a few days ago, on the day that the extradition bill was, the announcement came that it was going to be withdrawn from Carrie Lam. And even though we shouldn't call Bonnie a protest leader, she was very clear in the minutes after that announcement that this was not going to change anything, that the protests were going to continue. I think, as Jonathan mentioned, I think what I can hopefully bring tonight is a small slice of what I've seen on the ground there. And it is quite astonishing, this protest movement. It's compelling, it's fascinating, how it's unfolded, how it continues to unfold, and the determination of those who are involved in it. I've had a couple of stints there recently. July 1st, I was lucky enough to be there, if you can call it luck, when the storming of the Legislative Council building took place, which was in itself amazing to watch, given what had unfolded through the course of the day, and in fact leading up to that day with a lot of police presence, etc., and then to see the police simply melt away, and for the protesters to be more or less allowed to storm into this building and do a lot of damage along the way was pretty amazing to see. And then more recently, I think the weekend of the 25th, 26th, we saw a bit of an uptick in the violence again. And then August 31st, September 1, I think August 31st was particularly intense, perhaps the most intense, which is when the protesters sort of it's a pattern, I think, as Jonathan will attest to. You see huge marches organised, particularly on the weekend, during the day, and they are very peaceful events, attended, as Bonnie said, by millions of people at times. And then as the day wears on, you will see, sometimes violence break out, particularly into the evening. And on that day, as I say, it was particularly intense because there didn't seem to be a lot of organisation on that day. I think Bonnie may be able to confirm, but I think that was the day that her group had requested permission to stage a march. It was rejected by the police, but of course, hundreds of thousands of people came out anyway. And there didn't seem to be a lot of direction. People were just wandering around many, many parts of Hong Kong, but huge numbers again. And then a lot of people sort of seemed to gather around the government building, which houses a lot of the government departments, which is in basically the same complex as the Legislative Council building, which they stormed on July 1st. And that's when the trouble started, and it was pretty intense on that day, with a lot of objects being thrown across the barricade into the government compound, and the police responding with a lot of tear gas, rubber bullets, and that was the first time we saw the water cannon used. We'd seen them deployed, I think, the weekend earlier, but they didn't really use it much. And then this time they used it quite a lot, and they introduced the blue dye to try to stain the protesters, to identify them, who had broken the law effectively. These water cannon trucks are very new to the Hong Kong police force. They'd only just got them I think maybe a month or two ago. And we're only testing them a few days before that. And you don't want to get sprayed by a water cannon truck. I've been sprayed by them in Bangkok when they've been laced with chemicals, and it's not a pleasant experience. The Hong Kong police don't seem to know how to use their trucks just yet. They're at times spraying them into the air. The strength of them seems to be fairly weak at times, but I'm sure they will get better and better. I mentioned the compelling nature of this. One of the reasons it's compelling, of course, is because the players are involved here, and the main one is, of course, that we talk about is China. The fact that these young people, for the most part, are, perhaps using the wrong term, but rising up against the might of China is, fascinating in itself. But it's also because of who is on the streets. And I think it's important to emphasize, when I'm doing live crosses from the streets hour after hour, I try to explain, exactly what I'm seeing on the ground and exactly what's unfolding. And to people on the other side of the world, they may not, they may think they see violence taking place and they may think that these protesters have guns or, are throwing bombs or whatever. People sometimes don't understand what's going on. And I have to say, for the most part, these are not street thugs who are on the streets of Hong Kong. They, as far as we know, are not backed up by any external force in terms of resources, as much as the government in Beijing wants to portray this as a colour revolution backed by foreign forces. It certainly doesn't appear to be that way. These are young students, for the most part. Some of them secondary school students, but mainly university students. A lot of women as well, particularly, also at the dying stages of a day when the violence takes place. It's not just young men. There's a lot of young women there who are involved in the action, as it were. So I think it's really important to emphasise that, and Jonathan will have seen the same thing. And their determination, whether you agree with some of the tactics, and a lot of attention internationally, of course, has gone on what they did at Legco with the vandalising, train stations and things like that. So whether you agree with the tactics or not, and Bonnie alluded to, them feeling like they have to resort to violence to get the message across and try to achieve their goals. Whether you agree with that or not, you have to sort of, if you're a democratic, sort of free-minded person, you almost have to admire what they're doing. Through the course of months and months, these guys are still and girls are still turning up in their thousands and sometimes in their millions, and there is absolutely no sign that it's going away. And we're fascinated by it because we don't know where it's going. And I mentioned China, and one of the big questions is, of course, that we've been asked constantly is what China will do. And I think everyone's keeping a close watch on the 1st of October for the anniversary in China to see exactly whether that is a day that China wants to safeguard in terms of not having any major unrest on the streets of Hong Kong during that day. After that, perhaps all bets are off, and let's see. Having mentioned that, I was talking to Jonathan before, the government buildings that we talk about where a lot of the attention of the protesters has gone onto is right next door, for those who don't know, to the People's Liberation Army garrison in Hong Kong. It is a huge building, and for the most part, the protesters have completely left that building alone. I've noticed in the last few weeks that some of them are shining, they're using a lot of laser pointers now, you may have seen on TV, shining it in the eyes of the police officers. And in the last few weeks, I've noticed they're starting to shine them on the PLA building. But a lot of people on the front lines, as it were, will tell those guys off, and they will make sure that they don't do that. They will urge them not to antagonize the PLA, which is probably a smart move. So thank you again for having me. It is, I'm happy to take questions after we wrap up. But it's a fascinating thing to cover and something I've never experienced before.
Thanks very much, Wayne. That's great. And I'll echo everything you said as well. I also found it extraordinary, and they are the most inventive protesters. It's quite extraordinary watching them show up armed with hex keys, Allen keys, and cable ties. That's their main weapon. They've got all this sign language they use. The teams, everyone has their role. They run in and they start dismantling the railings in the middle of the road and locking them together in these kind of triangles with cable ties. And then another team of runners will run the triangles of railings up to a road they want to block and start locking them together. And within 5 minutes, they can completely block a road. I've never seen anyone do that before, and the speed they do it with is quite extraordinary. They would be absolutely brilliant at putting together IKEA furniture. Or perhaps dismantling it. Michael, perhaps you give your own perspective on the unrest there has been and on the tactics the police have used.
Yes, thank you, and also thank you to the board, and it's great to be here with Wayne and Bonnie. So, of course, the recent scenes of rampaging Hong Kong police out of control, I think, elicit in a lot of us an emotional reaction, this sort of moral discomfort. But coming from a human rights background, it's also important to point out that beyond the emotional or moral discomfort. The actions of the Hong Kong police are very much so outside of any legal parameters, of international norms and standards on policing. We know the images of tear gas canisters being fired from elevated positions, from high buildings, directly at demonstrators in closed indoor spaces, rubber bullets being used excessively, the water cannons laced with blue dye that Wayne mentioned, which, of course, if the intent is to identify who the demonstrators are, spraying a water cannon into crowded places is among the definitions of indiscriminate, because it marks everyone who is on the street, not just the demonstrators, of course. We've seen the use of batons, serious physical beatings. Not only demonstrators, but journalists have been targeted, street medics have been targeted. They've been detained, they've been roughed up, they've been prevented from providing care for other injured demonstrators. Now, admittedly, some protesters have been violent, the Braves, or whatever you want to call them, of course, but by and large, the million-strong mass mobilization has adhered to nonviolent tactics. Some police have been wounded. But the police have a monopoly on violence, and partly because of that, there are strict obligations for them to observe proportionality and only to deploy force under the strictest of circumstances. And yet, of course, we have seen time and time again, with increasing frequency, the indiscriminate and excessive use of police force. A lot of this tear gas or bullets and so forth are euphemistically referred to as less lethal weapons. But don't let the name fool you, because, of course, these can inflict serious injuries and, of course, even death when deployed wantonly outside of strict standards of acceptable use. Since the protests began, the Hong Kong police have fired thousands of rounds of tear gas, rubber bullets, and various other munitions, which have repeatedly, as I've said, violated many international norms. This includes, as mentioned a moment ago, firing tear gas canisters from elevated positions or directly at demonstrators. Standards are pretty clear because doing that, you can kill people. The less lethal munitions become very much lethal munitions when used this way. Firing tear gas canisters in closed spaces, as we've seen happen inside of the MTR, in confined areas. Not only does this pose serious health risks for physical health, respiratory concerns, as well as the mental, psychological impact that the chaos, the confusion, the uncertainty produces, which quickly escalates the situation and causes bystanders to become targets and significantly increases the risk of physical force or injury. I think it's worth pointing out that tear gas is a chemical weapon. Its use as a riot control agent in an armed conflict is actually considered a war crime. When the Chemical Weapons Treaty was being negotiated, the negotiators managed to get on enough state party signature to ratify the convention by basically making this sort of Faustian bargain that tear gas would be permitted for domestic law enforcement purposes. But again, don't let the name of being a less lethal weapon fool you. Don't forget the fact that it's a war crime in an armed conflict, and yet police around the world routinely use this to control their own populations. In some jurisdictions, in the U.S., for example, the ACLU has been campaigning for a total ban of tear gas. But obviously, until that happens, its use is permitted, but again, under strict circumstances for various reasons. The United Nations Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement and Basic Principles on Use of Force are very clear in that, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross, which, interestingly enough, specifically holds that even at unlawful but otherwise peaceful demonstrations, police must refrain from any actions which are likely to lead to or escalate the risk of injury or death. So again, even in demonstrations in Hong Kong that have not had legal permission to take place, again, as we've seen, they're overwhelmingly nonviolent, which means, again, that the police actions are flying in the face of various norms and standards. So not only that, but because of that, they constitute some pretty serious human rights violations, which has led to twice the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issuing statements calling on the unsanctioned use of such less lethal weapons by the Hong Kong authorities, and asking for Carrie Lam and the officials to not only protect the freedoms of expression and assembly, but also to investigate the police use of force. Characteristically, the Chinese government, in responding to Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner's comments, has accused such statements as being an interference in China's domestic policy, which just recently you may have seen that China also accused Germany of interfering in China's domestic policy because it happened to meet Joshua Wong in Germany. But international law is clear about the right to remedy when human rights are violated. And that often begins with an effective and independent investigation. And this is why, obviously, the 5 demands that we heard about include a call for an independent commission of inquiry. The Hong Kong community has pushed for this. The international human rights community has pushed for this. And yet, Carrie Lam has continued to rebuke these demands, saying that any investigation, all complaints will be handled by existing domestic complaint mechanisms. But the existing mechanisms, the so-called Independent Police Complaints Council, the IPCC, and the Complaints Against Police Office, CAPO, have been criticized on a number of occasions by the UN Human Rights Committee for lacking independence, for lacking effective power. They have no ability to call hearings. They don't have power to subpoena. They can't make sentencing recommendations for any type of punishment for police or others that are found to have violated domestic or international law. So what can they do? Well, very little. So as long as there is no effective domestic mechanism in existence, the need for creating one is paramount. And as long as there is no movement to do so, the police are only more emboldened to engage in increasingly violent tactics. They have been able to do so with impunity to point, and the more the government refuses any investigation, authentic independent investigation, the more likely we are to see the police continuing to violate such standards in their escalation of violence. And I think that in many ways, outside of speculating what China or the Hong Kong government might do moving forward, one place that we definitely can be more active as citizens of other countries in the world that presumably come from so-called democratic or human rights or rule of law abiding countries is, again, to put pressure on our elected officials, on our governments, to find a way to hold the authorities in Hong Kong accountable. And there are things that, of course, the international community could be doing in coordination with each other to put more pressure on the Hong Kong government in lieu of it adhering to its obligations to investigate properly. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A if of interest. Thank you.
I was just going to quickly follow that up, Michael. Do you believe that the tactics of the police, which certainly have got rougher, is just pressure? It's been 14 weeks of protests. They're also Cantonese. They feel the hatred of people around them. Or do you think it's a deliberate strategy to get tougher with the protesters?
I mean, I think it's a lot of different things happening. I mean, the Hong Kong police certainly have had a reputation for many years of being among the best trained, best equipped, most disciplined police forces in the world, certainly in the region. And I mean, this is something that Jonathan and I were discussing before. These are very, very concerning acts of police violence, of course. But if you compare them to what's happened frequently in places like Cambodia or Burma or elsewhere in the region where demonstrations have taken place, violence has been just as bad or worse. Of course, that doesn't absolve the Hong Kong police of doing what they're doing. But I do think that the escalation in violence is, of course, very concerning, and it's a sign of there has certainly been something that has changed in terms of the organization, the training, some of the new equipment, such as Wayne mentioned, perhaps being introduced without proper training. A tremendous amount of pressure, I'm sure, is on the Hong Kong police internally, within the police force itself, which is, again, an incredibly powerful domestic lobby, which is largely responsible for holding back or putting pressure against any type of independent investigation, obviously. But again, clearly pressure from China to find a way of resolving this. I mean, some of the acts that we've seen take place, some of the storming of the LegCo, for example, there was speculation that this was sort of a setup by advisors from China to allow it to move forward, to then capture certain images to portray the demonstrators, to portray the Hong Kong population in a certain light. And of course, lo and behold, a few weeks later, CCTV and other Chinese state media came out with their documentaries, exposés, chaos in the streets, violence. And just today, on the anniversary of the September 11 attack in the US, China Daily posted a picture of the Twin Towers and said, terrorists are planning the same type of activity in Hong Kong. So, I mean, just as much as the police are escalating it with their indiscriminate use of force, the authorities that be in Beijing and elsewhere are certainly not making things better with its incredibly, incredibly dangerous disinformation campaigns that they're waging.
Okay, I'd like to throw the floor open to anyone who wants to ask questions. There's a microphone there. Just before you do, Bonnie, I just wanted to bring you back in. I think many people listening to your description of the protest movement and its goals will be thinking, well, the reality is you're up against China, which will not budge and will not tolerate this kind of dissent. It's extraordinary in many ways that it's happening. And also, in 28 years, Hong Kong reverts back to Chinese rule. I'm playing devil's advocate here, but a lot of people would say, what's the point? You can't win. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, about the 28 years, actually, I have a lot of questions like this throughout the campaign. But to be honest, before this campaign, I didn't think much about this deadline. Because, well, for a lot of us, after 28 years, I'll be 60 years old. A lot of people could be dead, in Hong Kong. It's about our whole lifetime. So we have to preserve our home for ourselves. In our lifetime, to enjoy the freedom, the rule of law, the human rights that we have always been enjoying. And also, around the time of the handover, a lot of people believe that, well, if Hong Kong can preserve our system, we may be able to be a force to help China to modernize their system. Because, of course, if we compare the two systems, Hong Kong people already enjoying the freedom, human rights, etc., etc. If one day China decided to modernize their systems, ditch the tyranny, and decided to be more democratic, they can learn lessons from Hong Kong. And also a lot of people from China, for example, tourists, students, businessmen, etc., they would come to Hong Kong. When they come to Hong Kong, they enjoy this kind of freedom. They know about the truth about what happened 30 years ago in Tiananmen Square. We believe that it will change their mind. So we are hoping to be a force of improvement for China. This is our contribution as a city of China to China. This is what we always think. So to respond to your first question about, well, China has a lot of red lines, and they certainly, because Xi Jinping is such an iron-wristed leader, so well, of course, they're going to use all of their force, using all of their means to destroy this campaign. As Michael has said, a lot of propaganda already started. And also the Hong Kong police force are trying really to arrest everyone. So what's the point? Well, I would say that Hong Kong people know exactly that Beijing has a lot of red lines, too many red lines. If we care about those red lines, if we care about Beijing telling us what we can do or what we cannot do, none of these movements would happen. We can just all kowtow and obey. But Hong Kong protesters, Hong Kong people also have our bottom line. As I said in my introduction, that we are not greedy. All we ask for in this campaign, all we asked for in the past decades during our democracy movements, is that we want the basic law, the promises in the basic law. We want one country, two system, high degree of autonomy, rule of law, human rights, and universal suffrage, which had been promised to be respected. And we want protection. We want safety in our home. That's all we need. We're not greedy. And we want to preserve all these values, to preserve Hong Kong as our home, so that we do not have to flee this city. We do not have to flee our home. So that is what we want, our very humble demands. And also the bottom line of Hong Kong people. That is why Hong Kong people feel the need, the necessity to soldier on, despite Beijing having to cross Beijing's red lines. So it is about the people's power, the people's voice against the tyranny's voice, the dictator's thinking. So this is the fight that we must carry on.
Thank you very much. Can I have the first question, please? Please identify yourself here and who you want to direct the question to.
Okay, microphone's on. I'm Larry Doors. This is open for the panel. First of all, thank you. It's an amazing happening there in Hong Kong. I'm really interested in agents provocateurs. And it's so ordinary for agents provocateurs to be used in a situation like this to undermine the credibility of peaceful demonstrators and so forth. And given the real sophistication and cleverness of the protesters, I'm just curious, up to this point, is there evidence of the use of agents provocateurs, and what sort of tactics might the demonstrators be using in order to identify and to defend themselves and their movement against such agents?
Thanks for that question. Bonnie, I might go to you first on that. And I will say from my own experience, being at the airport when it was occupied about 3 weeks ago, they caught 4 people there that they believed were infiltrators. One turned out to be I think a China Daily reporter, but the others, well, one was certainly, we think, a policeman. People were very emotional about it. There have been Hong Kong police themselves, of course, who have been dressing up as protesters. How do you deal with that when infiltration is a very common tactic of authorities in this region?
True. We now have evidence, and the police admitted that they have undercovered people among the protesters. They would mingle with us. They may befriend some of the protesters, and they would make arrests afterwards. What they already did, caught on camera, was that one police force was seen trying to incriminate a protesters by implanting some weapons into their backpack. So it was very, very lucky that it was totally caught on camera. And because everybody covered their own face, and because the police have admitted that they do have undercover people mingled among the protesters, we sometimes doubt, a lot of people doubt actually, that, well, when you see protesters set fire, when you see the protesters crossing the line using much violence, is it really the protesters, or is that a police force? So the police actually opened the door for doubts about these matters. And also, except the Hong Kong police force, people are also talking about any secret agents or police force from mainland China involved. Of course, we do not have real evidence, so it is a question that we all need to think about. But we see some sort of clues that, well, some police officers also covering their face, hiding their police numbers. We don't know who they are. We cannot check who they are because their face is covered. Some people caught them again on camera that some police officers speak Putonghua instead of Cantonese. And also some pictures show that some people talking to the police officers looking like they were giving some sort of instructions. They show that a keychain of that man's from that man's pocket shows that writes Chinese police. So clues like that happen. We see these things.
Do you see the risk in this, though? Because what I saw at the airport was very paranoid protesters attacking people very violently because they believe they're infiltrators, and they might have been, but this was in front of passengers. It did actually, people thought, a lot of damage to the cause of a protest movement, which up to that point people have thought of was very idealistic and peaceful. In fact, we saw some very, very angry scenes, people being kicked, beaten quite badly because they believed they were infiltrators. I mean, this is a risk for your movement if people start to think like that.
Totally. In fact, why, of course, what happened in the airport was quite horrible. And I'm very, very grateful that protesters in the very next morning apologized to all passengers and apologized for what happened the other night. But what I want to say is why people went so angry in the airport was, first, a girl lost her eyesight because shot by the police. And second, because, as I said, undercover police were discovered just the other night. So they just discovered, oh my God, the police is doing such dirty works, undercover people mingle with us, and police force trying to incriminate protesters by putting weapons in their backpacks. That is why the protesters were so angry on that day. Of course, there is no excuse, but that is what happened. So, as you said, rumors like that or fear of these things would actually stir up the emotions of the protesters. But we learned from our lessons. We try to be calm about it and to face all these rationally.
Wayne and Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, your impressions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of the cases you're talking about in the airport. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I think from my take on it is, having watched a lot of the videos as well as having been there myself, is that any infiltration that's going on, for the most part, now is to arrest people, in an undercover situation, rather than trying to instigate any trouble. I'm sure that has probably happened, and I think I'm right in saying this accusation or suggestion first came up when they stormed Ledgecove. And the police, as I say, simply melted away, and I think that afterwards everyone sort of thought, well, hang on, what's going on here? So I don't know that it's any sort of tactic to instigate the trouble. And the reason I say that is, or the reason I have that hunch is because, if you take the weekend before last, when I think was, as I say, probably the most intense violence that we've seen over a sustained period, there were still hundreds, well, actually probably a couple of thousand protesters who dug in longer than I'd ever seen them dig in before outside the government building and fought. And yes, you could argue that it may have been started by someone who had infiltrated the movement. Maybe they threw the first rock. But, it wasn't all infiltrators who stayed on and fought, put it that way.
Yeah. Next question, please. Frank.
Hi. This is Frank Fu from Guangming Daily, China. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi.
I hope that you could come here in Bangkok so that maybe we can have the kind of communication or debate overnight, I think, because there are so many issues that I want to discuss with you. Okay.
Sure.
I'll start from point one. Just now during the Q&A, you said that you want to offer the kind of model to the China mainland to show the kind of freedom. And so personally, I would like to give you my personal response to this. Thanks, but no. You know why? Let me give you two reasons. One, Hong Kong, in the past, now, and in the future, is part of China. So, as a Chinese, when I see the kind of slogans longing for the independence of Hong Kong, I cannot agree, I totally oppose. Point two, when I see the protesters was hanging the flag of the US during the time of a trade war, I totally disagree, I strongly oppose. So, a big thanks and no. And I should also thanks for your frankness. My name is Frank. I really thanks for your frankness. But I'm somewhat shocked, you know, because you said that, if I memorize right, you said that strategy is necessary, and also sometimes force is necessary. I'm really shocked. I'm even more shocked when after you mentioned that, you said that openly, and another panelist here also said that he thinks that the protest was generally peaceful. So when you see the kind of airport blockade, when you see the kind of subway being interrupted, and when you even there are the kind of cases like in the aircraft, the oxygen bottle being emptied, do you think these are still empty? These are still peaceful? And Bonnie also, at the start of your talking, you said that you want to you are representing Hong Kong people. I'm not sure how much you could represent Hong Kong people. If you are aware, today in the UN Human Rights Committee, there are also ladies there to tell in the state of Hong Kong there. And I don't know how much you are going, that you said you represent, you are thanks on behalf of Hong Kong people, how much you could represent the Hong Kong people. And lastly, I would like to finish my question quoting a British citizen, a senior British citizen who are living in Hong Kong. He was interviewed on July 2. He said that, let me quote, they have the right to protest, but they have no right to do the violent actions. Hong Kong is a place based on law, not based on violence. No one have the right to do so. If I come to your home and make your home a mess, and even broken your precious treasures, and then I turn away, say, sorry, I don't like you. Can you? I think you have no right to do so. Thank you.
Frank, I'm going to assume you're speaking as a loyal citizen of China here rather than as a journalist. You're speaking as a loyal citizen of China here rather than as a journalist. Am I correct in saying that?
I think both. I'm a common Chinese and I'm also a Chinese journalist.
Fair enough.
Thanks. Yeah.
Let's let Bonnie respond to that.
Okay, thanks a lot. A lot of questions. I'll try to be brief. First of all, thank you for asking me to visit Bangkok. I would very much love so. But in this movement, I would also like to invite you to come to Hong Kong to see through your eyes what is really, really happening instead of just see through some propaganda machines. I try to write down your questions, so I'll answer one by one. First of all, you said about independence. That is one of the misunderstanding by a lot of Chinese, actually. The whole movement of Hong Kong is about preserving one country, two systems. A lot of Chinese people and Beijing always focus only on one country, and they do not respect two systems. All Hong Kong people is trying to do now is to get Beijing to respect and honor the two systems, to respect what they have promised in the basic law, and also the joint declaration they have signed a few decades ago. And second of all, you said that force is totally unacceptable. Well, I want to say that Hong Kong people had, for a very, very long time, very, very allergic to force, any kind of force. As I explained in my introduction, that it occurred to us suddenly on the 12th of June that there is times when facing the tyranny, when facing the dictatorship, that force is necessary to preserve our home. In your question, you compare can someone go into my house and break everything? I would say no, but that is what's happening in Hong Kong. We want our two systems, all the values, all the freedom, human rights to be preserved. By introducing the extradition bill against the willingness of Hong Kong people, is like breaking into our home and destroy everything. So when somebody is trying to break into our home and destroy everything, we need to do self-defense. And on the 12th of June, when I say clashes is necessary, that is a self-defense. And you also mentioned, can I represent? How many Hong Kong people can I represent? I can tell you this is a leaderless movement. I cannot represent all the Hong Kong people, of course, but at least throughout the campaign, at least 2 million people agreed with the 5 demands. I think I can representing them when fighting for 5 demands. You mentioned that 2 ladies went to United Nations to talk about human rights issues. And I think Michael here can explain more detailed than I do. What they say about, everywhere in the world can use tear gas bombs, rubber bullets, etc., etc. So it's all right for the police force in Hong Kong to use these things. I'm sure Michael can tell you that those ladies are actually wrong. Yeah, that's about it.
Frank, did you have anything else to say?
May I just have a very quick response? Bonnie, I'm very grateful for your response, and I especially appreciate you said that to the kind of independence is not the kind of goal of your movement. I really appreciate that. I also fully believe and hope that that's not the purpose or the will of a majority of the Hong Kong people. This is point 1. And point 2, you mentioned about my metaphor, like someone broken in your house, and then you said that to the extradition bills. If we want to discuss or debate about extradition bills, maybe I think it may last the whole night. So I just saying I'm not fully agree with you in that point. Okay, thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, we have any more questions? Please, go on up.
Hi, Bonnie. My name is Ian Martin, and what I'd like to ask you, I have seen a proposal that those people that hold the British national overseas passports should in fact be given a full British passport. I understand when you said that people don't want to leave, but I feel sure that this would give increased protections.
What was your question? You wanted to know whether Bonnie approves of that or not?
The holders of the British national overseas passport.
Are you asking whether Bonnie, that's a strategy or not? Is that your question?
Well, I want to know what she feels,
sure,
whether
understood.
she thinks it's a good idea or not.
Thank you, Ian. Bonnie, the issue about British overseas passports.
Thank you. From my group, I didn't have the authorization to on behalf of my group to say yes or no, do I support this. But from me personally, I'm a holder of BNO, although it's expired. I think I need to update it. Well, I think a lot of people before the handover rushed to the immigration department to get this BNO, just to want to have some sort of protection that I mentioned throughout this panel. But actually, BNO can give us no protection because we do not have the rights of abode there. Really, it provides no protection at all. So now when Hong Kong is in danger, I really think a lot of Hong Kong people are getting their BNO updated. And also a lot of people want to have a protection. We may not leave Hong Kong even if we have full citizenship in Britain. But I feel that if we can have that, a lot of Hong Kong people will feel safer, because if one day we feel the need to flee our home, at least one place will welcome us.
Thank you. Michael, yeah.
But I'm talking about being given a full British passport. Would you wish to have a full British passport which makes you a citizen?
Yes, because as I said, we may not leave Hong Kong because this is our home. But because we're in danger, I'm talking about lack of human rights, lack of freedom, and no democracy. And police brutality is taking place. The government of Hong Kong is not being accountable to Hong Kong people at all. If somehow this movement fails, things will just get worse and worse. And I fear that sooner or later, if it happens, if it's worsened, Hong Kong people will need to flee. So if we have a citizenship in Britain, it will provide some sort of, a choice, a safety net for us. But as I said, Hong Kong is our home. I really do not want to see this happen.
Michael, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, not to diminish the potential of protection that's offered by full dual citizenship, just also by point of to really, I think, illustrate the severity in which China behaves outside of most norms and standards, with a number of cases. Most recently today, the Beijing government admitted that a Taiwanese citizen, Li Mingchu, or Morrison Lee, who had disappeared from Hong Kong a few weeks ago, had in fact been kidnapped from the streets of Hong Kong, thrown into a van, and driven across the border into Shenzhen, wanted for crimes of endangering national security, which by all accounts amounted to having posted pro-Hong Kong demonstrator posts on Facebook. He's a Taiwanese citizen. The manner in which he was disappeared from the streets of Hong Kong echoes almost identically how Li Bo, who was one of the Causeway Bay Hong Kong 5 booksellers to go missing in 2015, the same way in which he disappeared from the streets of Hong Kong only to reappear months later in China. Li Bo is a British citizen. His colleague, who he also worked with, that was redundant. Anyway, his colleague at Causeway Books, who was abducted from Thailand in Pattaya, Gui Minhai, he's a Swedish citizen. He was born in mainland China. He's a Hong Kong resident, but a Swedish citizen. He was kidnapped from Pattaya. Thai authorities may or may not had a role to play in that. I'll watch my words, cognizant of being in Thailand, but Chinese authorities certainly were responsible for that, and he appeared months later on television providing a forced confession, just as Li Bo did in 2015 as well, and very likely as we can expect from Morrison Lee soon. And these are by far not the only individuals who have foreign nationality. The fact that they are Chinese ethnically or Chinese born, some people have said, okay, well, in the eyes of the Chinese government, which is very nationalistic, everyone who is remotely Chinese is effectively property. But it's not only them. 2 Canadian citizens, of course, right now also, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, since December, have been held in arbitrary detention in China for all intents and purposes, purely as pawns in a diplomatic spat between China and Canada over the lawful detention of a Huawei executive. So, yeah, of course, in some regards, having dual nationality, although China doesn't recognize it necessarily, but having nationality of the U.S., the U.K., Australia, Canada, maybe what we would consider big, relatively powerful countries to support you, may provide some protection, but there's no guarantees.
Thanks very much. Do we have any other questions, please? Please. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Barbara Parr. I'm an American who has lived in Asia for nearly 40 years. 18 years in Hong Kong and now 20 years in Thailand. There's been a lot of discussion tonight about the perhaps brutality of the Hong Kong police force. And this may sound like a very naive question, but I'm just curious about, in order to be a member of the Hong Kong police force, is it a prerequisite that those individuals must be Hong Kong citizens? Or could there be PRC individuals who staff that police force?
I don't know if anyone can answer that question. I would assume, Bonnie, you could probably tell us that most of the Hong Kong police force are Hong Kong citizens.
Well, yes, I believe so. Actually, I have to admit I never checked. This is a very good question. But at least they have to fulfill some requirements that I believe, for example, that they have to be fluent in Cantonese. So I believe only Hong Kong citizens, or at least lived in Hong Kong for a very, very long time, can be eligible to apply to be one of the police force. But that is a very good question. I should look it up.
Okay, thank you very much.
I mean, one of the things that interested me was that among the people that they detained at the airport, some of them had mainland Chinese ID cards, and they thought one of them was actually a mainland Chinese police officer. We never got that confirmed whether he was or wasn't. He looked like a police officer. He said he was a journalist, but he was built like a police officer. He was very physically fit. He had short hair. Didn't look like any other journalist. So,
I don't know about that.
As we're all, unhealthy slobs. None of us look that fit. Let's have the next question, please. Yeah.
Good evening, all. My name is Cass. We sell aircraft spare parts. If anybody needs any, we have them. Bonnie, please. Excellent talk. The original thing was the extradition bill, correct?
Yes.
Now it's democracy. It just came out of nowhere, really, although everyone knew it was going to come out. Do you think that was spontaneous, or was it planned to bring democracy into the equation? And I guess my basic question is, will it be a Tiananmen all over again?
Okay.
Yes, but I can answer your question with a very simple observation of mine. As I mentioned, on 12th of June, people risk their life, risk their everything to stop one evil bill. And we've seen evil bills ever since 2002, 2003. The first evil bill was about the national security bill. We call that the Article 23. That's the first evil bill that would destroy Hong Kong and destroy our rule of law and human rights, etc. And then now we have the extradition bill, another evil bill. So if the government, together with pro-Beijing legislators, if they anytime dream up another evil bill, Hong Kong people will have to risk everything, risk our life, risk our future, risk our everything to stop just one bill. So to stop just one evil bill. So how to stop this thing? How to have a real protection that can make the Hong Kong government be accountable to Hong Kong people? The only way, in our mind, is by the ballot box. Without the universal suffrage, how we cannot make the Hong Kong government be responsible, be accountable to Hong Kong people. So although it seems to be spontaneous, it seems like why you add one thing to your movement, why you add this demand that seems to cross in Beijing's red line. Well, because it is all about protection. We want to preserve our home. And about Tiananmen Square, yes, we are of course aware of it. Hong Kong people had been memorizing what happened, the massacre in Tiananmen Square for 30 years. So when we talk about the Chinese army, the first thing we think about is, well, if they really come out, will Hong Kong be another Tiananmen Square? We're aware of it, but because this movement, because the protection that I've talked about is too important to Hong Kong, so we will continue to soldier on. Whether or not Chinese will deploy their troops to kill people in the streets, it depends on them. But of course, if it is in Chinese mind, if it's in Beijing's mind, I would say it is a very, very bad strategy, because Hong Kong is not only important to Hong Kong people, it's important to China as well. You see a lot of businesses are done in Hong Kong, and a lot of cash flows, a lot of money in Hong Kong by not only the Chinese government, but a lot of officials. So a lot of things are at stake. I really hope that the Chinese government would not one day decide that they would ruin everything just to retain their power in Hong Kong.
Next question, please.
Paul Risley with the club. I think this is probably a question to Bonnie again, but I welcome your insights as well. 1 year ago, the counterpart to this club, the Correspondence Club of Hong Kong, had its president, Victor Mallet,
Yeah.
after maybe a month or so, tossed out of Hong Kong with his visa not approved, not reapproved. At the time, that seemed like an incredible overreaction by the Hong Kong authorities. And maybe it's a sort of thing that would occur now with more frequency, but at the time, it really seemed like a strange reaction. He had merely chaired a panel that had discussed the forbidden word of independence or democracy or something like that. My question to you is, where are those decisions made? Because I really cannot see Carrie Lam as the person who decided that a Financial Times journalist needed to be kicked out of Hong Kong to give a lesson to everybody else. So I really wonder, in the horrible events that are going on now, the terrible, what I see as overreactions by the security services and by the police, are those decisions being made in Hong Kong, or are they being made perhaps in Beijing? And how are those governance processes worked out?
Well, maybe we start with you, Bonnie, on that.
Okay.
You know, help explain, broaden it out, explain what Carrie Lam is doing.
Well, a quick answer is that I want to know as well. We of course don't have evidence, but I agree with you that it is unlikely that Carrie Lam or the Hong Kong government officials would make such decisions, because it's just out of character of Hong Kong. We always treasure the freedom of speech, and we respect journalists from around the world. So it's very, very unlikely from my point of view that Carrie Lam actually made that decision. I think it's articulated by Beijing. And also, you said it's a overreaction, but I think it's, well, carefully planned, because the brilliance of doing that is to give a warning to Hong Kong people that pro-Hong Kong independence is not accepted. And also, another brilliance of this plan is that actually before the FCC incident, before the Victor Mullet incident, and a few years ago, actually somebody talked about Hong Kong's independence in a university, scholar discussions. Why now a lot of people are discussing it? I'm not saying that a lot of people are supporting it, but why so many people are starting to discuss about this idea was because of our former chief executive C.Y. Leung. Before C.Y. Leung mentioned about pro-Hong Kong independence in a open occasion, actually not many people discuss about it. Only in Hong Kong University, some students published a book talking about it, but actually is a book inside the university. Not many people have actually read that. Not many people were discussing about it. But because C.Y. Leung actually mentioned that, emphasized the need to condemn those people, people started to buy the book, people started to discuss about that. And the brilliance of it is that because they created, C.Y. Leung created this label, and then now they can stick this label to anybody they dislike. They stick this label to Joshua Wong, to Agnes Chow, to some political parties that they dislike, and then they can disqualify them from running legislative council elections and also district council elections. So it is very carefully planned, and it's not only about whether or not a reporter will be renewed their visa, but it's also about taking away the basic human rights of Hong Kong people.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you.
You waiting, this gentleman here, please. Yes.
Question to Bonnie, basically. But
could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Rolf Hansen. I'm used to live in Hong Kong about 20 years ago. I'm a former Norwegian diplomat. Question basically to Bonnie, and that's about, you haven't really expanded too much, but one of the demands being universal suffrage. Of course, there were clauses in the basic law about that which were not really followed up. Could you expand a bit more about how would you see the way forward on that particular issue, and how would you get there? Second question somebody else spoke about but wasn't really answered, and that was sort of the use of British and American flags by the demonstrators. Is that the sort of a wise tactic, or does it sort of send the wrong signals to, let's say, Beijing about the overall purpose of the demonstration? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bonnie, perhaps you could start with the universal suffrage plan. It is in the basic law, I know.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. About universal suffrage, how to get there, to be honest, I don't know. All I know is it's promised in the basic law. It should have happened on the 2012. A few years ago, so we're still not having that. And 5 years ago, Beijing gave a decision, what we call the August 31st decision, that basically mean that we'll give you one man, one vote, but Beijing have to screen the candidates first. So it's fake universal suffrage. So obviously it's a red line of Beijing. They do not want us to have it. Our guess is if they allow Hong Kong people to have universal suffrage, if they uphold their promises, other places in China, for example, Xinjiang and a lot of places would just follow us. They would request the rights. So that's why it's a red line of Beijing. That's what we thought. How to get there, I don't know. But as I said, without universal suffrage, we can't get the Hong Kong government to be accountable to Hong Kong people. So it's important. It's the only way that we can preserve Hong Kong as Hong Kong. So we will soldier on, although we do not know exactly the route to lead to that. And your second question is about the flags. Actually, this whole movement is a leaderless movement. So if you ask me why those people would wave those flags, to be honest, I don't know. And because it's a leaderless movement, I'm not qualified to tell them not to.
Am I right in saying that, I mean, there was the only time I ever saw a British Union flag was one old lady who I think got arrested, but she was there at every protest. She was the only one carrying a British flag. It was a very big one, and she was always there, but it was doing her own thing. I did see there were two guys, I don't know if you saw as well, Wayne, who always showed up with large American flags. They were the same guys. I mean, it didn't look like a policy. These were kind of individuals as far as I could see.
Yes, it is totally voluntary. So I don't know why they do that, but obviously, because you mentioned 3 people, but actually more and more people are waving flags from different countries. My guess is that they want to get their attention, these countries' attention. We want to get their support to this movement. And also it shows the sentiment of Hong Kong people that although we know that we are Hong Konger, we know that legally we are Chinese, we're part of China, but the sentiment is we want the outside world, the other countries, to support us instead of urging the Chinese government to.
Don't you then run the risk, though, don't you run the risk that essentially this gives fuel to China's allegation that there is foreign intervention here in China's internal affairs?
Strategically speaking, honestly, I think yes, but it shows the sentiment, and it's their right to do so.
Yeah.
That's it.
Michael.
Yeah, I mean, China's going to claim interference in its domestic affairs no matter what anyone in Hong Kong does, no matter what flags they wave. If they waved Chinese flags that were made in Canada, China would claim interference in their domestic affairs. That's what China does. And I mean, I think that there is something to be said for the possible strategic blunder that it does add some fuel to China's disinformation. But I mean, obviously, as we've seen, for ages, but particularly since, say, the Arab Spring, all authoritarian regimes love to claim one form of color revolution or another, and so, clearly China is working on that. But, I mean, I think it sort of misses the point of, as Bonnie said also, I mean, who are the likely targets of these symbolic actions? Well, it's not the Chinese government, obviously. It's the nations whose flags they're waving. And what's happening in those nations right now? Well, in June, Jeremy Hunt, the British Foreign Secretary, said that in response to the escalation in police violence, and the fact that some of the equipment and technologies that were being used by the Hong Kong police were manufactured in the UK, were British companies, that the UK would halt all current licensing on the export of such technologies to Hong Kong. FactWire, which is a Hong Kong-based investigative journalism center, has documented British, American, Czech, Swiss, and several other companies that make these equipment that are sold to the Hong Kong police force. And right now in the United States, U.S. Representative Jim McGovern has put a bill forward that would likewise halt the sale of crime control detection and equipment to Hong Kong, which is actually something that's sorely lacking in the fact that since, as people have sort of made some parallels with the Tiananmen Square massacre, after that happened, the U.S. Congress imposed what are sort of colloquially referred to as the Tiananmen sanctions, which, among other things, explicitly call for very serious vetting of any export licensing of crime control detection, et cetera, equipment to the mainland. And so really extending that to Hong Kong is long overdue, and obviously, as we've seen right now with what the police are doing, is called for. But also, other members of the U.S. government have called for, have put forward what is called the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which, for various other things, would call for a re-examination of Hong Kong's economic status, which sometimes it's portrayed just along those lines, but one of the provisions would be that officials in Hong Kong who are proven to have culpability and gross human rights violations and so on would have visa travel bans, not be allowed to go to the United States, and any assets that they have in U.S. financial institutions would be frozen. I mean, this works the same way as the Global Magnitsky Act, which is in the U.S. and Canada and the U.K., a handful of other countries. And it doesn't only mean money that's in those banks, it's also financial transactions that go through those banking institutions. In the United States, banking institutions are at the center of a vast majority of international money transfers. So it's a pretty serious potential targeted sanction for individuals who are culpable for some pretty serious human rights violations. So when people in Hong Kong are waving U.S. flags, I mean, I can't speak for them, obviously. I don't know what all their motives are, but presumably a lot of it is to signal members, influential stakeholders in those countries to rise up, to take possible actions that can hold Hong Kong and Chinese officials accountable, because they're obviously not holding themselves accountable.
Just one point: if you sanction and ban sales of non-lethal crowd control to countries, then don't you leave them the only option to use lethal methods to control crowds?
Possibly. I mean, China also produces its own non-lethal crowd control equipment, which presumably the police in Hong Kong would just rely on more. But regardless of the sort of like consequentialist reasoning, I mean, international law also puts a burden on governments. I mean, there's a legal obligation, obviously, on states, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights likewise put, it's not, hard law per se, but it puts an obligation on companies to mitigate the, negative human rights impact of their equipment. So, I mean, there's an obligation on these companies, even if it might not lead to, roses and rainbows, there's still an obligation on them, I think.
I'll make this the last question, if that's okay. Please.
Hello. My name's Simon Hollins. I'm a member here, retired. I just want to address the statement that Carrie Lam made, that the real crux of the problem may in fact be inequality in Hong Kong and the price of real estate. I mean, obviously these things like human rights, independence, democracy are issues that are current, but Hong Kong has lived without these things for many years. Possibly she hit a valid point there, where the future of many of these young people is maybe living in a birdcage in a country which doesn't provide them with any assets to respect the law which protects those assets. That's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Bonnie, let's throw that to you.
Okay.
Is this really all about the enormous pressures of living on young people and their lack of opportunities?
First of all, Hong Kong people lack democracy. We never had a full democracy in our history, but we do have rule of law, basic human rights, freedom, etc. For example, I'm 32 years old. For all my life, I've enjoyed all these values. So if you take that away from us, it's a very, very big deal. And secondly, Hong Kong people understand that why this inequality exists is because of the political system. Because the chief executive is only elected by 1,200 people who are mainly controlled by Beijing, and a lot of them are tycoons. So the government, because they have to look at their voters, they have to please their voters, they make their policy looking at the tycoons. That is why the property prices and the rent is so high in Hong Kong. And also that is why Hong Kong people, especially the young people, think that our lives are so miserable. So we can connect the two things together. If we have universal suffrage, the government will not only need to look at tycoons, but also need to look at the general public. That's what we need. And we also believe that this is promised. This is our right. So dealing with the inequalities that we're facing now in Hong Kong only solve the face of the problem, because deep down, if we have universal suffrage, the government will need to do the same. So we have a sort of principle or tactic that people are saying whatever benefits the government is going to give us because they want to soothe this movement, will take the benefit, but will continue to continue this movement, continue to fight for our rights.
Wayne, I just wanted to ask you, because you've covered so many other protest movements before, I mean, how this one compares to other movements that you and I have both covered. It's quite unusual, isn't it?
It's very unusual. And I think it's quite interesting watching how they've tried to keep it relevant. You know, they continue to try to reinvent themselves. They use social media incredibly well. They even produce these amazingly slick videos, I think probably stealing a few clips from here and there that they shouldn't use, but they're amazing productions to try and encourage people to still come out on the streets day after day, week after week. And one of the interesting ways it's evolved also, and Bonnie talked about it before, but perhaps we haven't emphasized it enough, is that the police have really become almost public enemy number one. It is incredible. You'll go into these communities where the protesters may have vandalized a train station, which has become fairly common now. Eventually, the riot police will show up quite late. By that time, most of the protesters have gone, or they've mingled with the local community there, changing their clothes. The police will spend an hour, maybe two, sort of, I don't know what they're doing, to be honest. The tactics are very strange, running around, chasing ghosts seemingly at times. And then eventually they will leave, hop into their, we're talking a lot of police, hop into their buses and leave. And the chorus of abuse that they are receiving from the people standing by. No one's throwing anything or attempting to attack them, but it's verbal abuse, and it is quite telling. It is incredible. And I think, as you mentioned before, it's probably quite dangerous going forward that the police have become such an enemy now of this movement.
Thanks very much. Listen, I'd like to wrap it up. Thanks very much for coming, and a big round of applause thank you, Bonnie Leung, for staying up for us, to Wayne Hay, and to Michael Caster. Thank you all.